So here, hi, it's Mr. Tush over at Global, and we're going to talk about App Inventor's database called tinyDB. The presentation I'm about to show you was originally created by Dr. Ralph Morelli over at Trinity College. I just did a couple of small tweaks to it for the purposes of our class, but I did want to give credit where credit is due. Now, the App Inventor, what is a database for starters? Let's talk about that. A database is a structured set of data that's held by a computer. You can usually get into it a bunch of different ways. You can manipulate the data, you can list it different ways, you can pull certain data and leave others there. You can do things to analyze what's inside of a database, and it allows you to put a bunch of information in there and then make sense of it later. It's kind of a great way to look at a database. Now, tinyDB is App Inventor's version of the database, and it stores data permanently on the device. Now, you're going to learn about databases over time, and you're going to find that there are some full-featured ones like MySQL and Firebase and CloudDB, and Microsoft has its own proprietary one, so does Oracle. And some of these databases run major companies, they run governments, databases are powerful. We're using a very tiny one. Now, the other thing I really want you to pay attention to is this line right down here, that data are stored in tag value pairs. What does that mean? Well, each item in the database has something called a tag, and that needs to be a text string. It's a line of text, and that tells you what type of data are in there. And then the value is the data itself. So the tag is what it's called. The value has to also can be a number, string, or a list. So the tag is like a title. It's the type of data. And the value is the data itself. And the reason you have to speak in those terms, you'll see in a minute. Sometimes you're storing letter strings like lists of names or single names. Sometimes you're storing lists, and sometimes you're storing numbers. So that's why we have to call them values, because they're not always a number, they're not always a text item. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Now, this over here, this little cylinder here, imagine that as like a bucket or a silo. And we're going to use the App Inventor blocks. This App Inventor block here called store value. This is how I put something in the database. And you'll look in the block and it needs something called tag, which is the type of information that's there. And we're saying that we're storing a name. And we're going to put in a text string. This is Ralph. And you'll notice, by the way, I mismatched the lowercase r with the uppercase r. I apologize for that. But I'm putting the word Ralph in here. And then if I'm pulling something from it, I'm going to use a block called a get value block. Now, we'll get into how this works later, but if I'm getting the value, I'm going to ask what tag am I looking for first. So if I want to find something, I need to ask what tag first. And then I'm always going to give it a default value. This is, okay, what to bring out if the tag is not there. So if I called for a tag called name and there was no tag called name, it would give me, in this case, this blank empty screen. Next, here's another version of it. Now, in this case, you'll notice we're storing numbers. As we said, we can store text strings like names. We can store numbers. In this case, because I'm calling it score, I'm signaling to the user, you're probably looking for a number. I might use the word TWENTY 20 to include that number, but now I'm going to use actual numbers. So 90. So when I put it in, I'm going to put in the tag called score, and I'm going to say this score is 90. And then when I pull it out, if there is no tag called score, I'm going to give it a default value of 0. So I'm going to tell the database, if you're pulling something out and there's nothing under score, just call it 0. Now, this one, and this is going to be something we're going to be using very soon, this is how to pull values as a list. So if I call this my list, which is just an obvious way to name something so that the user knows, or the programmers who look at my code know, I'm storing a list of values. I've got them 3 kinds of fruits here, apple, banana, cucumber, and I'm going to put that in there as a list. Now, when I pull it out, I'm going to actually tell it, look, if there's something in there, it's going to return these 3, apple, banana, cucumber, as a list. If there is no tag called my list, I told it create an empty list. So that's what it's going to do. That is the short version of how to understand what a database is and how to use tinyDB in App Inventor. On to our apps.